So what you're looking at is the human brain. I sketched this out earlier, and within this I'm actually going to show you the part of the brain that is responsible for your breathing. This is the area that I'm drawing little green circles in, or the areas really, where the breathing is controlled. So these little green blobs, they represent little cells, and these cells are going to be making decisions on how fast you breathe or how deep you breathe, all sorts of stuff. And these two areas then, because they're going to be communicating with each other, I'm going to circle the entire area and say that this entire area then is your respiratory center. So this respiratory center is going to be collecting information. It's going to be getting information about all sorts of things that we're going to go over here, and it's going to make a decision based on that information as to how your breathing should be. So this is our central command in a sense. This is our respiratory center. Now some of this information it's going to gather is going to come from local neighborhood cells, and these are the central chemoreceptors. These central chemoreceptors are called central because they're part of the brain. They're in the central nervous system. And they're chemoreceptors because they're picking up on chemical levels, specifically carbon dioxide levels. They're going to also have information about the pH. So they're going to actually give the respiratory center this valuable information about these things. Now, if we have central chemoreceptors, you can probably guess that we have peripheral chemoreceptors. And these are the ones that are actually not in the brain. These are actually in other parts of the body. So these peripheral chemoreceptors, there are actually two types, and they're both going to detect primarily oxygen, but also they detect carbon dioxide and pH as well. So these two types, let me just label them one by one. The first one is going to be the aortic body, and the body part just means a body of tissue. And you also have carotid body, and these are going to be located right between the internal and external carotid artery. So these peripheral chemoreceptors are going to send their neuron projection over to the respiratory center as well. They're something like this. And of course, you know these neurons aren't going there just kind of by themselves. They're going to be inside of a nerve. So the carotid body is going to be traveling inside cranial nerve number 11. And the long name for that, or the formal name of this one, is the glossopharyngeal nerve. I'll write that like that. And then over here, that is going to be traveling, or the information is going to be traveling cranial nerve number 10, also known as the vagus nerve. So these are the nerves that are carrying information from the peripheral chemoreceptors. So far our respiratory center is getting information about chemicals, but there's also other sorts of information it might receive as well. For example, it might get information from mechanoreceptors. And these guys are basically going to relate information about pressure. So you might be thinking, well, I thought that the pressure sensors were called baroreceptors, and it turns out that baroreceptors are one specific type of mechanoreceptor that you find inside the blood vessels. But there are actually many types of mechanoreceptors, and one you might find in the nose. You might find another one in the lungs. I'm actually just going to give a couple of examples here, and maybe one in your GI tract or your gastrointestinal tract. So a few different types of mechanoreceptors. So how do those work exactly? Well, the ones in the lungs and the GI tract, those are fibers that are going to detect pressure, and those fibers are going to run inside, you guessed it, the vagus nerve. That's why I actually am drawing it together. So those fibers are going to run inside of that cranial nerve number 10. The nose is actually also going to have some mechanoreceptors, and those neurons are going to also go to the respiratory center, but through a different nerve. This is going to go through what we call cranial nerve number 5, also called the trigeminal nerve. So these are just the names of the nerves. I'm throwing it out there just in case you come across them. But let's get a little bit more concrete. So let's say that in your nose you have a mechanoreceptor. Well, what would that do exactly? Well, let's say that you're breathing in on a spring day a bunch of pollen, and that pollen comes and sits in your nose. One of those mechanoreceptors might pick up the fact that you have a little bit of pollen there, and it feels the pressure of the pollen grain in your nose, and it'll send that information to the respiratory center. Similarly, you might have, let's say in your lungs, another mechanoreceptor that feels a little bit of cigarette smoke, a little particle of cigarette smoke, and it doesn't like it, so it's going to send a message to the respiratory center. In the lungs, another type of mechanoreceptor might be detecting stretch. For example, let's say you take a deep breath and distend the lungs. Then you might want to make sure the respiratory center knows that the lungs are fully stretched out and really shouldn't be stretched out anymore. And similarly, if our stomach is very distended, that information may also be sent up to the respiratory center through, in this case, the vagus nerve. So far we have information about oxygen and carbon dioxide levels and pH levels, and also about pressure and stretch. But there's also another type of information that's coming from here, and this is our hypothalamus. Our hypothalamus. And our hypothalamus is actually very interesting because it's going to coordinate information about things like pain, or let's say you're having some sort of anxiety, maybe about a test, or maybe you're having fear. Any of these kinds of responses, you might change your pattern of breathing. And actually the way that information is relayed to the respiratory center, the only way the respiratory center even knows that you're having pain or anxiety or fear, is that the hypothalamus is communicating that. So that's what that little drawing is right here, that this is a little neuron communicating information down. And finally, a fourth place that you might get information from is your cerebrum, right? So we have, of course, a lot of voluntary actions, things like singing, or let's say you play a musical instrument, or even things like yelling or screaming or whispering. Any of these kinds of things, you're going to want to control your breath. You're going to want to change the depth of your breath, the pace of your breath. And so any of those kinds of activities are going to be voluntary activities, and you of course can voluntarily change your rate of breathing as well. But the good news for us is that our respiratory center doesn't always need to be voluntary. Otherwise, we would be up all night just thinking about breathing. In fact, you probably couldn't do anything else. So it's good that this respiratory center can work without us consciously always thinking about it. So once all this information comes in, what happens next? What does the respiratory center do with all that information? And that's why I want to kind of bring up this picture. This is going to show you now where that information goes. And it's going to basically go to motor nerves. Motor nerves that are going to affect muscles. So we have muscles that are going to help us breathe and that are going to open up the lungs and allow air in. And there are a few different muscle groups. We're going to go over them very quickly. And these are the ones that are controlled then by the respiratory center. There are some nerves that are coming out of these three levels, C3, 4, and 5. And so these levels, C3, 4, and 5, are going to be responsible for a very important muscle called the diaphragm. And this is the large muscle that kind of lies below the lungs. So this is one muscle in charge or responsible for our breathing. The next set of muscles are the intercostal muscles. Intercostal muscles. These are basically the muscles between the rib bones. And each intercostal muscle has a nerve that supplies it. And so the nerves are going to be the ones between T1 and T11, all of these nerves. So this is another set of nerves that are going to be triggered by the respiratory center. Another set of muscles is our abdominal muscles. Abdominal muscles. So remember, the abdominal muscles are also going to be very important in terms of taking nice, long, deep breaths. And so these are going to be powered by the nerves here, T6 through L1 rather. So T6 through L1. Those are going to be your abdominal muscles. And then finally you have one last group, and that's the one at the top. That's this group right here, between C1 and C3. C1 and C3. And these are the accessory muscles. Accessory muscles are muscles, for example, in your neck. So if you reach back and feel those, you can see how they would be affected by breathing. They actually kind of lift up and again open up the rib cage. And there you have it. That's pretty much it. The respiratory center is taking in information from lots of different sources, trying to make a decision about how fast and how deep to breathe. And then it's going to put out information, and that information is going to flow through nerves that are going to go down to the various levels in the spinal column that you see here, and those nerves are going to affect muscles. And these are the 4 major muscle groups that basically allow you to breathe.